Hi and welcome to GRVOTV, G's Reviews, Views and Opinions. I've been asked for this question a couple of times now, so I thought I'd do the review and give you my opinions, and that's Panasonic Lumix GX8 versus the Panasonic Lumix G7. Now, when you look on YouTube for both of these cameras, the camera that sort of seems to get the most adulation, and I apologise for the changes in the exposure. The sun is so bright off my back and it's coming in and out. It's an absolute nightmare, so I'll do my best for the video. Anyway, the camera that's getting the certainly more exposure and adulation is the Lumix G7, even though the flagship is technically the GX8. So I wanted to go through the pros and cons of both, and is the GX8 worth the extra money, and which one I'd recommend. Obviously, as you can see, I've got both here. I'm also recording on the G6, the one before the G7, and so I've got quite a lot of experience in the G series of cameras. I've had the GH4, the GH3, the GX1, the GX7, the GF3 as well. So, you know, I've had the majority of this whole range, apart from the GM1s and the GM5s. So if we just go through specs that are different, the main difference is the GX8 has got the 20 megapixel CMOS sensor as opposed to the 16 megapixel in the G7, which is like an updated version of, you know, what's been in pretty much all of their cameras. Now, the jump between the G6 and the G7 is quite noticeable, especially when it comes to low light, high ISO settings. And I would say there's probably 2 stops difference. So whereas the G6, I'd sort of really wouldn't want to push it anywhere near, sort of, I say 1600 would be my absolute maximum. The G7, I would push to 6400. Now, the GX8 and the G7 are actually quite similar, and the interesting thing, and I didn't really get this at first, when I was looking at the noise performance, especially at like, the maximum I go up to like for testing really is like 12,000. So when I was looking at the noise performance, what I noticed was the noise was not horrible harsh noise, it was quite sort of muted noise, and didn't degrade the image as much as I thought it would. Now, the difference between these two is, whilst the noise is roughly about the same, ever so slightly better on the GX8, the difference comes up in that because you've got the 20 megapixel sensor, you get a little bit more of the image intact. You get a little bit more definition and a little bit more detail in the image, but it's negligible. It's nice to have, especially if you have to crop in a little bit. That gives you a little bit more ability to do so on the GX8 than the G6, but ultimately there is a difference, but it's not huge. So would that be a deal breaker? Absolutely not. The second most important thing is the GX8 has in-body image stabilization. Now, the downside of that is it doesn't really work in video, and which is a bit of a shame. But I've tested, this is a 45mm lens on here, so at 35mm equivalent, 90mm shot, which should be taken at, say, 1/100th of a second to keep it steady. I've taken that, an image of a waterfall, for instance, at around half a second, whereby you can actually blur the water, but the background is actually in sharp focus. So the in-body image stabilization is very good. The fact that you can then combine it with if you use a lens that's got inbuilt stabilization, you then combine the two together and it gets even better. It gets crazy good. I'd say it's as good as the EM5 Mark II, which is fantastic. Now, the G7 obviously doesn't have in-body image stabilization, but if you only use Panasonic lenses with built-in image stabilization, it's not a real deal breaker. And if you're going to use either of these for video, you're really going to want image stabilized lenses anyway, or have the camera stabilized. So it's not as much of a deal breaker as you may think. And because the image stabilization that's built into the Panasonic lenses is so good, it's it's not so much of an issue. Before, I would have said, well, you can't get prime lenses that are stabilised, but you can now. Panasonic have started bringing them out, and also Olympus have even started bringing out stabilised lenses. I think their new 300mm f4 is a stabilised lens. So, and the 42.5mm Panasonic, the Nocticron and the standard one, they're both image stabilised, so it's not so much of an issue. So that's good. They both shoot around the same speeds. They've both got excellent buffers. They'll both shoot in RAW for a very long. Actually, let's put it to the test. I didn't really have this set up, but let's just 1, 2, 3. Alright, so there you go. Both a really good rate. They're both buffering at the moment. You heard the G7 obviously ran out first. They're both still buffering. I'm just going to leave it. So this is all real time, and we'll see how long that takes for that buffer to fill. Right, the G7's buffer is sorted. The GX8 is still going through, because obviously it took a lot more pictures. And it's done. So obviously the G7 cleared its buffer quicker because it took a lot less pictures. The GX8 took probably about another couple of seconds worth of pictures. So we'll just hear that again. G7 stopped. GX8. Now that's RAW plus fine JPEGs, so that's as hard as these will work, and that is an absolutely fantastic performance from both of them. So if you go just RAW only, or if you go JPEGs, you're going to have unlimited shooting. So no problems with the buffers filling up or the speed of either of these, so that's great. Both cameras use the same fully articulating screen, touch screens, and they're both equally fantastic. The G7 has a 3.5mm mic jack, and the GX8 has a 2.5mm mic jack, so you're going to need one of these to adapt it, and always buy one with a lead on. Don't buy the one that just plugs in, because they don't work. They get pulled around and move about. You need one that you can actually put that into the camera, and then if possible, put a little loop or a stick here, stick that to something so that doesn't move. So you need one of those if you buy the GX8. The G7 has a pop-up flash, the GX8 does not, so I've got a little Nissin flash that I put on the GX8, so that could be a deal breaker for you if you definitely want a little bit of fill flash, or if you're going to be using this flash to trigger other flashes. You can do it on the GX8, but you need transmitters and then a separate flash, etc, etc. So there is that. Not an issue for me. The handling, you've got rangefinder style versus SLR style. Now this G7 fits my hand perfectly. It's beautiful to hold in hand. You've got your mode dial for your single shooting, continuous 4K, bracketing, snap movie, things like that. You've got your main dial, your on-off switch exactly where it needs to be, front and rear dials with two function buttons on top and a record button. You've got your shutter button. On the back, you've got more function buttons. You've got soft function buttons. You've got this little switch, autofocus, single, continuous, manual focus, which is really nice. You've got an AF lock or an AF on button at the back, right where you want it, and it just fits really nice in the hand. Everything's where you want it to be. So handling wise, the GX7 is actually a little better, and especially if you're doing video, it's a little better. The GX8, on the other hand, you've still got the PASM dial, but you've got this lovely exposure compensation dial underneath, which you haven't got on the G7. But you lose the mode dial with the single, continuous, etc. shooting. But you've still got the autofocus single, continuous manual focus that I like, with the AF a function button in the middle. You've got an AF or AE lock button there, an AF on button there. You've got plenty of other function buttons, and then you've got ISO, white balance, and that mode dial on the G7, you just got a button there. You just press it and go into the drive modes. But because it's touchscreen, it's all simple. It's not an issue not having that dial there. I'd rather have the exposure compensation dial rather than that dial if I couldn't have both. Both EVFs are fantastic. The only difference is this one flips up. Whether that's something you want to use or not, I don't know. I've used it, I think, probably once or twice. But I wouldn't have missed it because the screens are so good on these anyway. You don't ever feel you have to use that. So that's not a deal breaker. As I said, both have front and rear dials. Both rear dials have got a function button in there, and there's a function button on top of both, so that's roughly about the same. So all in all, they're both fantastic cameras. My choice is the GX8 because I like that extra bit of resolution. You do get a little bit extra dynamic range in the images as well, which you may or may not notice, but there's definitely a little bit more room for manoeuvre there. And the raw files, you can definitely pull a little bit more out of the highlights and shadows than you can on the G7. Not that there's anything wrong with the G7's files, it's just that there's that little bit more in the GX8. Now, after using the GX8, I wouldn't want to go sort of a step back, if you like, to the G7. But if I just had the G7, I wouldn't want for anything. I wouldn't really worry or be concerned that I only had 16 megapixels as opposed to 20. It really wouldn't be an issue for me. So really what it comes down to, in my opinion, is handling. Now, weight-wise, the G7, depending on the lens you have, is definitely a lighter camera. But if you put like just a little, that's the 45-1.8 lens on the GX8, it's not a heavy camera by any stretch of the imagination. You can hang it off a wrist strap all day, or a side strap, or a neck strap, whichever you want. Both of these cameras are great for carrying around all day long. You won't have problems with either of them. So really, I'm probably not going to be much help to you deciding, other than I would go for handling over and above everything. So if you like the feel of the GX8 in the hand, which I do, I absolutely love it, and the controls all fall to place, that's what I would go for. For me, the G7 actually handles better. Everything's in the right place for the G7, but because I've already got the GX8, it handles well enough that it's not a deal breaker for me. So even that doesn't really come into it, the handling. Aesthetics, should we go for aesthetics? I think the GX8 looks better, and yeah, there you go. That's a reason for having the GX8. It's weather sealed. The G7 is not. So if you need a body where you're going to be shooting outdoors on a regular basis, and you might get in, shooting a little bit of rain, or some harsher conditions, shall we say, then that would definitely be a reason to go for the GX8, because you stick a weather sealed lens on there and you've got a nice little weather sealed kit. The G7, you haven't got that. As much as I think it would probably stand a light shower, don't hold me to that. It's not weather sealed, so it's not one that you can really rely on in harsh conditions. So there you go. I'll throw up a couple of pictures. It's not a great place, YouTube, to compare, because there's not enough difference in the images really to see which one's which. You won't even be able to tell. So I'll just put a couple of pictures up at the end just to show you the kind of quality you can get out of either of these cameras. But for now, this has been my comparison between the Lumix G7 and the Lumix GX8, and it's been filmed on my G6. This is GRVOTV, G's Reviews, Views and Opinions. I'll see you soon. Bye.